The place feels ordinary, too ordinary to be dangerous. People are sitting close to each other, lost in their own world, scrolling through phones, exchanging small laughs, waiting for time to pass. Nothing about this moment feels like the beginning of a problem. There are no raised voices, no anger. And that is exactly how racism often starts, not with hate screaming out loud, but with comfort, with familiarity, the belief that nothing bad could possibly happen here. Comment slips out. It's quiet, almost playful, the kind of remark that's followed by a smirk instead of an apology. A few people hear it. Some pretend they didn't. One person chuckles awkwardly, unsure whether to laugh or look away. The person it's aimed at freezes for just a second, long enough for their chest to tighten, long enough for them to realize they've been singled out. But they say nothing. They've learned that reacting only makes things worse, so the moment passes, or at least it seems to. Moments like this don't disappear. They sink in. They pile up. What looks like a harmless joke to one person becomes a reminder to another that they don't belong, that they're being watched, judged, measured by something they can't change. Around them, life keeps moving. Conversations continue. Phones keep scrolling. Silence wraps around the room like a protective shield, not for the victim, but for the behavior itself. This is how racism survives. It's not because everyone agrees with it, but because too many people choose comfort over courage. Because it's easier to stay quiet than to risk becoming the next target. Because calling it out feels awkward, impolite, or unnecessary. And with every unchallenged comment, something shifts. The line moves. What once felt unacceptable slowly becomes normal. What no one realizes in this moment is that something has already been set in motion. Boundary has been crossed, even if it doesn't look like it yet. The person who made the comment feels emboldened. The silence feels like permission. And the person on the receiving end carries the weight alone. Wondering how many more times they're expected to swallow their dignity just to keep the peace? This story isn't about one insult or one person. It's about what happens when small acts of racism are allowed to grow unchecked. When silence turns into complicity. When the cost of speaking up seems higher than the cost of staying quiet until suddenly, it isn't. Because there always comes a moment when racism stops being subtle, stops being disguised, and goes too far. And when that moment arrives, it doesn't just expose the person who crossed the line. It exposes everyone who stood by and watched. The question is not whether racism will escalate. The question is who will have the courage to stop it before the damage becomes impossible to ignore. The room was bright but quiet, filled with people moving through their daily routines. Some were chatting softly in corners, others scrolling endlessly on their phones, lost in their own little worlds. It was the kind of day that felt safe, normal, unremarkable. But under the surface, subtle currents of judgment were flowing. People glanced at one another and sized each other up in ways that weren't always obvious. Not loud, not threatening, just small, unspoken assessments. And that's the way racism often begins, not with shouting, not with confrontation, but with comfort. With hidden biases that are brushed off as normal, casual, acceptable. In one corner, a group of friends laughed at a joke that carried a sting. It wasn't a mean-spirited joke, or at least they told themselves it wasn't, but the words landed like tiny darts, and the person the joke was about forced a smile, laughed along, hoping the attention would pass. Eyes flicked briefly toward them, just enough to acknowledge their presence, then moved on.
Oh.
No one said anything. The room seemed peaceful, but peace can be deceptive. Moments like these are the cracks where racism creeps in. The victim felt it immediately, a cold sense of isolation, an inner tightening that made every breath a little heavier. The comment, though fleeting, left a mark. But to speak up would risk ridicule, social ostracization, even further humiliation. So they stayed quiet. They had learned early that the world often prefers silence to confrontation. And around them, life carried on as if nothing had happened. That was the insidious part. When racism hides in subtle gestures, the world often pretends it isn't there. Meanwhile, the person who made the joke felt nothing more than amusement. They were confident that the room supported them, or at least didn't oppose them. They had grown used to saying things without facing consequences. And when no one spoke, their sense of power grew. One small act, unchallenged, becomes an invitation for another. The cycle quietly begins, often unnoticed by anyone but those directly affected. Throughout the room, other small acts unfolded, glances that lingered too long, assumptions made about someone's background, whispers that excluded a person from the conversation. Each microaggression seemed insignificant, almost invisible, yet together they formed a pattern. And for those living within that pattern, it was exhausting, heavy, impossible to ignore. You didn't need an overt confrontation to know that the system of bias was active, even in these ordinary moments. By the end of the act, the tension had not yet exploded, but it had taken root. Small seeds of prejudice had been sown, unnoticed by most. For the people witnessing it, it may have seemed harmless or forgettable, but the reality was different. Every quiet moment of racism chips away at someone's confidence, erodes a sense of safety, and builds a pressure that cannot last forever. And when the line is crossed, when silence continues too long, even the most ordinary place can become a battleground. The quiet tension of the room carried on, heavier now, though unnoticed by many. People who had heard the jokes or witnessed the exclusion glanced at one another and looked away. They didn't say a word. Fear, politeness, or uncertainty kept their mouths shut. Every act of silence reinforced the notion that such behavior was acceptable. Racism was not shouted in these moments. It was silently allowed. The longer it was allowed, the more powerful it became. The victim felt increasingly trapped. Each day, each interaction, each small remark piled up. What once might have been shrugged off now felt unbearable. And yet speaking up seemed impossible. The stakes were too high. Friends could turn away. Colleagues could mock them. Even strangers could respond with aggression. It was safer to stay quiet, safer to bear the weight alone, even if that weight was crushing. Meanwhile, the person perpetuating the behavior grew bolder. Every chuckle, every smirk, every small act of bias emboldened them. They sensed the silence around them as permission. No one had stopped them yet. If the room was silent, surely the behavior was acceptable, even invisible. Their confidence surged, fueled by the inaction of others. Complicity, after all, is often silent, subtle, and unspoken. The bystanders felt it too, in a way. A mix of guilt and self-preservation gnawed at them, but they did nothing. Some rationalized their inaction with thoughts like, "It's not my fight," or "I can't risk being involved," or even "It's just a joke, why overreact?" But every rationalization built a wall of protection around the racist behavior, reinforcing the idea that nothing would change, that the silence was all that mattered. The pressure on the victim continued to mount. Their sense of belonging, their sense of safety, slowly eroded. They felt like an outsider, a spectator in a world that didn't notice their pain. And in the shadows of that room, small sparks of anger began to burn. They wondered, quietly, silently, how long it could go on before someone finally intervened, before someone finally said, "Enough." By the end of this act, the room was a powder keg. Silence had transformed from passive observation to active complicity. The behavior had grown stronger because it had been ignored. And every individual present, whether actively participating or silently observing, had played a role. Racism thrives when people look away. The moment of reckoning, the moment when things would go too far, was steadily approaching, though no one realized it yet. The room that once felt ordinary now carried an invisible weight. The subtle remarks, the side glances, the quiet jokes, small sparks that had been ignored, had now begun to combine into something more intense. People were no longer just watching. Tension was simmering beneath the surface. What was once a small, uncomfortable moment had escalated into an undeniable confrontation. No one realized how close they were to witnessing the line being crossed. It started with a single comment, sharper than before. A remark aimed not just at difference, but at identity. The words were meant to provoke, to expose, to embarrass, and everyone could feel it. The victim froze, heart racing, mind spinning. This was no longer subtle. It wasn't a whisper or a joke anymore. It was a direct attack. The air around them felt electric, like something in the room had shifted, and everyone could sense it, even if they didn't yet understand what it meant. The silence, once protective, now felt dangerous. The bystanders began to squirm. Some avoided eye contact completely, pretending nothing had happened. Others exchanged quick, anxious glances, unsure if they should intervene. Fear, shame, and indecision clouded the room. Each moment of inaction reinforced the power of the aggressor. Each pause, each breath held, each refusal to speak gave the behavior more weight. The line between casual prejudice and outright hostility had been crossed, and no one was stopping it. The victim's internal world was collapsing. Every insult, every smirk, every silent observer piled up in their mind like a storm threatening to break.